Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the government's Bill 5 made huge waves at the legislature this week, including the ejection of an MPP and predictions of blockades.
For the first time in a decade and a half, members of the legislature are getting a pay boost.
The Financial Accountability Office has a report on the state of the province's books, confirming the Ontario economy is deteriorating.
And Your Column, My Column looks at why Ontario isn't the only place looking at something like Bill 5.
And My Column focuses on a guy named Macdonald, who's been living in a crate on the south lawn of Queen's Park for 5 years, who's finally been released to see daylight again.
It's Friday, June 6th, 2025, the 81st anniversary of D-Day, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little sugar to start with here.
Sir.
I am very glad that you mentioned the anniversary that you just did, because if you are watching this on television or YouTube or listening to the podcast on the day it drops, it is June the 6th, and very good that we note this anniversary. It was a huge turning point in World War II, the Allied invasion of Normandy, and I bring this up because I got a call a couple of days ago, you may not be surprised to hear, from Lieutenant General Richard Romer, noting that the anniversary was coming up and that he, of course, had been over there at the time doing his reconnaissance in the moments after D-Day. The general is now 101 years old and is enjoying quite a renaissance, having returned to Queen's Park last fall for the Remembrance Day ceremony, and I think we've got a picture of that we can put up. There is look at that chest full of medals, and there he back at Queen's Park enjoying the ceremony. And if you can imagine, last month he went to Holland as a 101-year-old and spoke at the VE Day ceremonies in the Netherlands. So good on you, General Romer.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously it is a part of history that I only know really like third hand, except that my grandmother was a Red Cross nurse in the UK, and I never got the opportunity to talk to her too much about her service, but she did have a story about like the hospital that like the field hospital she was working at. I think she said it had to triple in capacity overnight after Normandy because there were so many wounded coming in, and the nurses got a system going to get basically like get the wounded but still living men off of the boats on the train to the camp, like to the hospital in record time. It is a part of our history, increasingly one that time is taking the still living people away from us. But worth remembering this.
A good day on the 6th of June. Well, any day actually is a good day to remember the greatest generation, but particularly so on the 6th of June. Now, shall we go from the sublime to the ridiculous?
Yes, let's.
From the sublime to the ridiculous. Why have you got a jug of milk on your shirt?
Well, so last week we talked about the throne speech and King Charles and the things that make Canadians distinct from Americans. And one of those things is bagged milk.
Is that right? They don't have that down there?
I am told that not only do they not really do bagged milk in the U.S., it's actually not even a pan-Canadian thing. It's really much more an Eastern Canadian thing. I've spoken to people from like BC and Alberta who are like, yeah, no, we don't do bagged milk at West. But it is just one of those distinguishing features of, apparently it all dates back to when we adopted the metric system.
Huh.
There's a whole story behind that, but even there, the metric system, another thing that distinguishes us from the Americans who, as I understand it, they believe centimeters to be communist or something. So, today I wear the milk t-shirt.
I like it, okay.
And you are, of course, wearing one of the first premiers I have very clear memories of.
Well, I'm going to get to that. I want to ask you actually about your childhood memories of this premier, and I'm wearing this guy today. This is Mike Harris, who 30 years ago this Sunday, on the 8th of June, back in 1995, won one of the most improbable victories in Ontario political history. His party, the Progressive Conservatives, were in third place going into that election, and they went from third to first in one election. And if you can't remember the last time that happened, it's because most of us weren't born. It was 72 years, I think, earlier that a party had gone from third to first. He defeated, you may remember, Bob Rae, who was the NDP premier at the time, and Lynn McLeod, who was the leader of the Ontario Liberals, and brought in what he called his, do you remember the expression?
Common sense revolution.
The common sense revolution, that's right. And his boast was, by the time we are finished governing, we common sense revolutionaries, There will not be one blade of grass on the south lawn at Queen's Park that will not have been trod upon by some protester. They really came into office determined to make big change, and as a result, we saw demonstrations the likes of which we had not seen, frankly, since the time Bill Davis was premier, and there were big demonstrations back then too. Labor leaders leading demonstrations, particularly teachers, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But you know what? 4 years later, Mike Harris and his revolutionaries got reelected with an even slightly larger percent of the total votes cast. So there you go. Now, you were in high school at the time?
I was, yes.
So you would have seen, presumably, or maybe heard from teachers who were, let's just say, not necessarily in love with the reforms that the Harris government wanted to bring in.
I do actually remember one of my high school teachers did vote for the PCs in the 1995 election and would speak for years afterwards about how he kind of regretted that choice. And yeah, it was an incredibly disruptive time to be in school, in high school, certainly. I don't think I went more than 18 months without some kind of disruption, right? If it wasn't teachers on strike, there's multiple different unions working in the education system, and a strike by any of them can disrupt the school year. And I can't remember if it was literally every year that got disrupted by strikes, but it sure felt like it at the time. And, just to play the tape forward a little bit, they did get reelected in 99, but by 2003, the series of disruptions and the feeling that the government, from 95 to 99, I think a lot of voters felt like Mike Harris was picking good fights worth winning. By 2003, I think that feeling had faded for a lot of voters, and instead it was like, could you please stop picking fights? And indeed, Dalton McGuinty wins the 2003 election in part on the promise that he would just make labor peace and calm everything down. And that worked.
Yeah, I think my recollection of the time was, how long can the revolution go on? Can you have perpetual revolution? And I think you're right. At some point, they ran out of steam, and the public had sort of had enough of it all. But on this occasion, the 30th anniversary of, well, you know what? Let's do a little scoop here first. I have been working on something for the past year that we're calling the Premier's Archive. And essentially, it is really deep dive interviews, an hour and a half, 2-hour interviews with all of the living former premiers. And I did do Mike Harris, several months ago anyway. We're just about set to launch this site, so stay tuned for more on this. And, of course, I asked Mr. Harris what he recalled of the events of 30 years ago this Sunday when he won that improbable victory. So let's hear from him. Mike Harris. When that campaign started, you were 25 points behind. I mean, I know you just said you thought you had a shot. Did you really think you had a shot at 25 points behind?
I thought we had a shot. And the campaign team thought we had a shot. The other thing that we all felt, the campaign team, me, all of us that had signed off on the Common Sense Revolution, that we think we're right. We believe in this. This is worth fighting for. If we don't win, we can wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, we fought for what we believed in. So that kept us going too.
Now, I have to say that had a lot of appeal at the time when people were kind of tired of politicians who sort of promised one thing and did another. And you heard this frequently during the Harris years. We may not like everything he did, but, he said he was going to do it and he did it. So I think many people appreciated that kind of strength. And I'm going to say that Mr. Harris is now 80 years old. Yeah. Of course, his son is a cabinet minister in the Doug Ford government. Many folks will be getting together this weekend for a Common Sense Revolutionary reunion, and I'm going to go cover that, snap some pictures, and we'll bring those to the fore next week on the pod.
I would just add, we're going to talk about the pay increase and the pensions that MPPs got, but that was just one example of how 30 years later, we are still, and I could make many other arguments about, policies and the institutions that we have in this province, but we are still very much living in Mike Harris's Ontario. The Common Sense Revolution massively changed the way money is spent, what government does, which orders of government do things. And
speaking of which order, we are in the megacity of the city of Toronto, the 416. That
precisely.
was his government that unified all those city councils.
Yeah, and so I would just say that while some of that was reversed under 15 years of Liberal government. Not everything, certainly. I would very much say that we are still living in Mike Harris's Ontario.
Okay, one last thing before we get to issue one, and that is we did our first onpoli podcast before a live audience. Was that last week?
That was just last week.
It was just last week. It feels like longer ago. Anyway, we did it at Victoria University on the downtown campus of the U of T. Really wonderful to see so many young people there. You know,
Yes.
I expected to see some people my age there and your dad's age, but so many young people in their 20s there. And, you know, they're all over social media telling us about it. So, and you've got some shots you want to show.
Right. So for our podcast listeners at home, we are looking at a photo from Logan Stitt, who attended our live show. He says it was a memorable experience to meet us both. And then also we have a post from Instagram user Jermaine, said he's taking a bit of a break from politics, but that we make following it a little less stressful.
That's nice.
And while we were on the topic of last week's episode, we did talk about a bill that is currently being co-sponsored by the Liberals and Greens. And I think on stage, you and I said that we couldn't remember another example of a bill that had been, a substantial bill that had been co-sponsored across party lines.
Which was accurate.
We
could not remember.
We could not remember it, but it was not, in fact, correct. So we were reminded of 2012's Toby's Act, which was Bill 33, that added gender identity and gender expression as protected classes under the Ontario Human Rights Code. That bill was co-sponsored by Liberal Yasser Naqvi, Tory Christine Elliott, and New Democrat Sherry DeNovo. Happy to be corrected on this, and also an appropriate note to start off Pride Month. We've got a few notable dates.
Now, who notified us about this correction?
It was Yasser Naqvi, in fact.
There we go. The Member of Parliament now for Ottawa Centre.
Yes, indeed. And we do have one other thing. There was an unusual proceeding at Queen's Park this week, and we're going to talk about it as much as it's a bit mortifying for you.
Wait a second.
MPPs
this is not in the script?
It is not in the script because you would have cut it. MPPs paid tribute to a certain journalist, a member of the press gallery, one of the two people sitting at this desk, and not me. We had statements from all of the political parties and independent MPP Bobby Ann Brady. They had very kind things to say about you. We do have a short collection of clips.
Oh my goodness.
Sheldon, if you would, please.
So I called Linda this morning, my wife Linda, and I said, look, I got all this great stuff about Steve, but I'm really struggling. I got a problem. I said, I've been here 12 years, almost 12 years, and I've never, ever been invited to the agenda. All my colleagues, she says, you're just not that interesting. So she's right. She's right.
I was on the agenda. The members as well.
The agenda is a staple in our House and has been for 19 years. And I'm looking forward to continuing to see Steve on the onpoli podcast. So I have a personal connection and gratitude to Steve, not only because he lets the entire world know that Elizabeth May and I share June 9th as a birthday with Steve Paikin, but also because I have been on the agenda.
I think I was invited on the agenda, but I would never go on the agenda. And I'm happy it's coming to an end, to be honest. You have done an amazing job for the people of the province of Ontario, and we're honored to have had you for so long. So thank you so much.
Now,
Oh,
I know you
goodness.
want to get this over with, but I will simply say we are grateful for the kind words from Terence Kernahan, John Fraser, Stephanie Smythe, Donna Skelly, Mike Schreiner, Bobby Ann Brady, Paul Calandra, and also we didn't get the clip here, but NDP leader Marit Stiles did also lead off her question period remarks with some kind words for you as well.
And Tom, the member for London North Centre, said something too.
Yes. So with all that
Rakocevic.
said, people had nice things to say about you, and I know you find this all embarrassing and uncomfortable, so I will let you take back the wheel, sir.
I would simply say I didn't know that was going to happen. They told me to come to Queen's Park, and I thought it was going to be a 1 minute long member statement, and that was it. And it did go on a bit, and I was both kind of deeply moved and mortified at the same time. I thought the whole thing it's a bit like going to your funeral, you got people saying such nice things about you. A couple of follow-up things, though. Paul Calandra, meet me on camera 3, Paul Calandra. You have been on the agenda. I know you like to pretend you haven't been on the agenda, but you actually have been on the agenda. Although I did try to book you numerous times in your former incarnation as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and you never came on then, and you haven't been on as Minister of Education. That all is true. John Fraser, parliamentary leader of the Liberals. I've been emailing your office now for 2 days trying to get you on the agenda because you showed me up there by saying you'd never been on. So tell your people to email me back and let's set a date for next week and we'll get you on there before this thing goes off the air. Okay, I'm done.
All right. We'll let this thing go. I have one other thing, but it can wait until after the cameras stop rolling.
All right, thank goodness. All right. Can we please get off to issue 1? Bill 5, the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Its Economy Act, became law this week, but not until the opposition parties, First Nations communities, and protesters launched a full court press against the bill. JMM, I guess we should go through some of what happened before this bill ultimately became the law of the province.
Right. So it did receive royal assent on Thursday, but before that happened, let's see, we mentioned in last week's live episode that there was actually an NDP filibuster happening as we taped that episode. The NDP filibustered at committee until midnight that week. At one point in the House debates, I guess it was actually during question period, the MPP for Kiwetanung, Salmamakwa, was ejected from the legislature for saying that the Premier was, quote, telling untruths to Indigenous communities about the bill. Our listeners don't need to be reminded that calling another MPP a liar is unparliamentary and will get you ejected from the House under the rules. Mamakwa was asked to withdraw. He refused to, therefore he was ejected. The bill went to what's called clause-by-clause consideration in committee, where they literally go through every clause of the bill and decide whether they're going to move amendments or not. The Liberals introduced 4,000 amendments in committee as an attempt to filibuster the bill. In one sense, it was kind of successful, but there was a bit of a strategic disagreement between the Liberals and the NDP over what to do with this bill. The NDP had introduced a small number of amendments to really pin the government down on cases where they would use the powers that Bill 5 will give them, and they wanted the government to swear off using them to, not to violate the labor rights laws or environmental laws or various scenarios that have been spelled out where, I think some unions warned that the government could legalize child labor again in Ontario, something the government has said it will not do, but the NDP wanted to force an embarrassing vote on this. That didn't happen because the 4,000 Liberal amendments basically just took up all the time at committee.
You know my favorite one of the 4,000?
Yeah.
I think there was an amendment in there that said, nothing in this act shall prevent the government of the day from continuing to call, whatever the date it is, Hazel McCallion Day.
Yes. Yeah, the first 800 or so amendments were, I think they must have literally just gone through and said, like, you cannot use the powers of this law to violate, and they just did, like, every single law that is currently in place in Ontario. So yeah, the Liberals got into a bit of fun. Now there was one substantial consequence of this filibuster was that also government amendments did not all get passed by the committee. People might remember that the government had proposed an amendment to Bill 5, and here we're talking specifically about the special economic zones powers, where they had promised that they would not use the powers of these special economic zones to violate Indigenous rights that are protected in the Constitution. That amendment never actually got past that committee because the Liberal filibuster blocked it out. So the bill that was then passed by the legislature is actually not the bill that the government wanted to see in its final form. So the Premier was asked on Wednesday, are you going to let this bill pass in its flawed form, flawed even by the government's lights, right? He said, yeah, the bill's going to go forward. Maybe they will bring a bill to clean it up in the fall. We don't know. But as far as the government is concerned, it is full steam ahead. Now, that's the legal or the legislative side of things. Global News has also reported that internal documents from the provincial government are saying that the access road into the Ring of Fire is something that has been discussed now for, going on 20 years. The Ring of Fire mineral deposits in the far northwest of the province. Currently no road access. The Ford government very much wants to build a road, and the government's own advisors are telling it that at least some sections of that road will not be able to even start construction until 2028. Part of Bill 5 might be, again, these special economic zones might be used to designate the road or the Ring of Fire itself as a special economic zone so that they can clear away some of what the government views as, regulatory or planning hurdles. But this is exactly what Indigenous communities are worried about, their rights and the procedural levers that they have being swept away. Minister of Indigenous Affairs and First Nation Economic Reconciliation, Greg Rickford, did tell reporters last week that it was too soon to say what will actually be designated as a special economic zone. But you could see that this is, the government has talked about designating mines in the north as one case of the use of these powers. So certainly the Ring of Fire has been a priority, not just for this government, but for two preceding premiers as well.
Indeed.
So it's sort of an obvious one.
I can just imagine some people sort of following in a cursory fashion this debate and saying, oh my goodness, the 4,000 amendments and all this filibustering and, delaying votes and so on and so forth. And is that all consistent with democracy? And, I think we should point out at this stage that, yes, the Doug Ford government got elected with 43% of the total vote and now has essentially 100% of the power as a majority government. But there are rules and provisions in our democratic system which allow the voices of those who don't agree with what governments are doing to oppose them. And one of the tools that they have is the filibuster.
Yes.
And so, you may think it's frivolous, you may think it's puerile, but the reality is it's part of our democratic system which allows time to just slow things down a bit. So on the chance that the government wants to rethink a particular part of the bill, they have the opportunity to do so. It's all part of I don't want to say it's part of the game, but it's part of the system.
Yeah, there's always a tension between majority rule and minority rights.
Yeah.
And we have that formalized in some ways with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But even before we had a charter, we had an understanding in the system that the majority can't always steamroll its way to everything it wants, not least that in a binational or multinational federation of the kind that Canada has been throughout its history.
Yeah.
So
this thing's passed now. So what happens now?
Well, the first test will be to see what the reaction of Indigenous communities will be. They've already very explicitly signaled their disapproval of this law. Some chiefs are warning of a return of the Idle No More movement. This was a series of protests that occurred during Stephen Harper's tenure as Prime Minister surrounding the passage of Bill C-45 that greatly affected environmental protections. Idle No More, I think you could argue, then led to the Impact Assessment Act under Justin Trudeau, which really tried to bring Indigenous consultation into the framework of existing environmental law. It's possible we could see similar protests in Ontario, like road and rail blockades. I mentioned last week, even if we get this one road to the Ring of Fire built, a single road is very easily blockaded, and that has been an issue up in James Bay throughout the history of the diamond mines there. The Premier was asked about this at Queen's Park on Wednesday. He said that the OPP will have to deal with any blockades if and when they occur. I think it's worth saying just for a moment that this is very much not a job that the OPP wants. When we had those Idle No More protests and there were blockades on highways and particularly rail lines, the OPP very much does not want to be put in a situation like the one in, and oh gosh, I'm blanking on the provincial park where Dudley George was shot. Ipperwash, thank you, geez. But the OPP institutional memory very much does not want to see any kind of repeat of Ipperwash ever again. They don't want to be put in this position. So it is not as simple as saying the OPP will have to deal with protests. Before we get, or either before or at the same time as we have to deal with protests, this law is almost certainly headed to the courts. And it is also going to be interesting to see how they deal with this question. Because, the Premier is not wrong when he says other jurisdictions in Canada, other provinces, the federal government are looking at laws like this, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But because so many different provinces and federal governments are looking at these kinds of laws, I think this is an issue that the Supreme Court is going to have to take up and clarify.
So stay tuned, everybody.
Exactly.
Indeed. Okay. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. For the first time in almost 2 decades, MPPs are going to get a pay increase, and they will be able to contribute to a more robust pension plan, which former Premier Mike Harris got rid of almost 30 years ago. MPPs have had their pay frozen for so long because successive governments, quite frankly, have been too terrified to give MPPs an increase, fearing the public might react very badly. Okay, what are the numbers now saying?
Right. So the base salary for MPPs will now be $157,000. That is an increase of $41,000 more than before. This initiative, is worth mentioning, had all-party support. In fact, it was basically passed on unanimous consent. We have talked in the past about how political parties at Queen's Park were really finding it difficult both to recruit candidates because the pay, while it's not exactly poverty, it's not as much as you can make in the private market, particularly for the type of work that we are demanding of MPPs. And even if you get a successful recruit and they win their seat, it's difficult to retain MPPs in their seats because a lack of a pension leaves a lot of MPPs, and we've talked about some of the cases on this podcast before, particularly when they reach that point where they have to start saving for their kids' education. MPPs have financial pressures of their own, and a lack of a pension made it very hard to hang on to good MPPs. So this increase of the raise and the recreation of a pension plan, it certainly looks like it will make becoming an MPP look like a more financially secure proposition.
Now, Premier Ford did manage to sort of figure out a workaround on this, which is to say, yes, the base salary of an MPP, relatively speaking, is low compared to other jurisdictions. So he just appointed a lot more people to cabinet.
Yes.
And he appointed a lot more parliamentary assistants, and he appointed a lot more committee chairs. And as a result of doing that, you get a pay bump for all of those extra jobs.
Yes.
So, okay, keep going. Take us through more numbers.
Right. So there's the increase in the base salary for MPPs, and then what the law already said was based on your position, you got a multiple of the base salary based on your position. So, for example, Doug Ford's salary will increase to $282,000 a year, which is about a $70,000 increase. Cabinet ministers will get an increase of about $58,000 a year. The government, however, is quick to remind people and perhaps cynical journalists that the base salary for an MPP here is still lower than that of either a Toronto City Councillor or a federal MP. They have, in fact, pegged it to 75% of a federal MP's salary.
Let's do a little walk down memory lane here, because I well remember when Dave Levac was the Speaker of the Legislature.
Yes.
He managed to call in all the party leaders at the time, so I'm thinking Kathleen Wynne was Premier, Patrick Brown was the leader of the Ontario Conservatives, and Andrea Horwath was the NDP leader. And they essentially had worked out an all-party agreement to give MPPs a salary increase, but then the agreement fell apart.
Yes.
And, because I guess it was probably too close to the next election, the Wynne government, the Wynne people thought, yes, we're all on side with this, but we're going to carry the can for it during the next election campaign. And as a result, the deal fell apart and it never happened. So kick the can down the road a little bit more. Doug Ford obviously has been Premier now in this newest majority government since February, March, April, May, so 4 months, very early in his third term. And I guess they think there's enough time between now and the next election that, we can do this and I don't want to say get away with it, but maybe memories will be faded by 3.5 years from now.
Any anger that exists will have cooled 4 years from now.
There are two ways to look at this, in fairness. You could say, oh my goodness, they're getting a 35% salary increase. That's absolutely outrageous. Yes. It's a fact. A 35% salary increase when everybody else around the public sector is settling for, ones and twos and threes is not, there's some optics problems there. On the other hand, you can say these folks have not had a salary increase in 17 years. So if you amortize that over time, it works out to about 2% a year. Yeah. So they're just sort of catching up. Pick whichever interpretation you prefer.
Yeah, and I would add just about the procedure that this happened. I mean, you mentioned that this was done early in a new parliament, and it was also done with a unanimous consent motion functionally. The government introduced the bill and had it passed. I think when we looked at the clock, it was like 11 minutes later. There was no debate. And on the one hand, you could say, well, this is terrible. They gave themselves a raise and they didn't even debate it properly. They didn't even hold a recorded vote. How are we supposed to hold people to account? And I get that. That is a totally legitimate view of that democratic accountability should demand better. On the other hand, I am actually pretty sympathetic to the argument that MPPs deserved a raise and that are beyond what I think about any individual MPP. I don't think Ontario was getting the best government that it could otherwise get. And if this is what it takes to get the raise and the pension and get it, and it just is a non-controversy, at least as far as the political parties are concerned, then sometimes this is how the sausage is made.
I do remember Mike Harris did it in the first place. He got rid of some politicians, right? He made the number of MPPs in the House smaller, and he got rid of the pension plan. And it was definitely meant to be a kind of, blow for populism. Yes. It was meant to strike a populist chord among the public, saying that these, fat cat greedy politicians are all getting too much money and their pension plans are too rich.
In the midst of one of the worst recessions in Ontario history. Yeah. So you can see the optics almost make themselves.
Yeah. The funny thing about this was that over the years, and we've chatted about this before, over the years, my hockey buddies, which is my great focus group for what normal people think, unlike us, my hockey buddies would often rail against, these fat pensions they get at Queen's Park, and they're constantly getting pay increases. And when I would actually tell them, actually, the pension has been gone since the 1990s, and they haven't had a pay increase in 17 years. They always say, really? So for all of the efforts of the Harris government to claim some credit for getting rid of all this, there were still lots of people who had no idea that it hadn't happened. So anyway, we'll see how my hockey buddies relate to this. And with that, let's get off to issue 3. The Financial Accountability Office of Ontario has released a report on the government's 2025 budget. As a reminder, the FAO provides independent analysis of the province's finances. So, JMM, let's go through this report and see what they had to say.
Right. So the headline on the report is that, perhaps not surprisingly, given recent events, the province's economic outlook has deteriorated. This is primarily due to U.S. Tariffs and what the report delightfully calls elevated geopolitical uncertainty.
Is that code for Trump's being crazy again?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, all right.
They have to zhuzh up the language, but yes. Incidentally, the report was written before Trump's decision to add steel and aluminum tariffs back into the mix here in Canada. So that is the kind of uncertainty that the FAO is referring to, I'm sure. The budget's outlook on the GDP is close to the FAO's tariff scenario. The FAO does different scenarios in much the same way that the budget does. They look at different possible outcomes for the province's fiscal state. The FAO had released a report on the potential effects of tariffs a couple of months ago, and now both the government and the FAO believe growth will slow because of the tariffs.
Knowing you as I do, I suspect you did more than just read the executive summary. You probably went 2, 3, 4 levels deeper into this report. So anything else catch your eye?
More than skim it, I would say. There is one section of the report that notes that in order for the budget's revenue projections for 2026 and 2027 to come true, the government will need to see much stronger than normal income tax growth. The province is saying that taxation revenues will grow much faster than the projected growth in normal times. So the FAO is pointing out a little bit of a dissonance there. Where normally you would expect income and sales tax revenues to grow along with economic growth. But for these later years at the moment, the finance ministry is basically projecting kind of middling economic growth, but very substantial income tax growth. And the FAO is sort of flagging that as a projection that might not bear out, in fact, and would be contrary to the usual trends that we see historically. During a recession, or any kind of economic slowdown, people tend to both earn and spend less money, and the government gets less tax revenue because of that. So we will see.
The 3 words that often sum up our discussions here.
Yes, indeed.
We will see. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Okay, everyone, you know this feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chat here about the columns that we wrote for our website, tvo.org, over the past week. Start us off, sir.
Right. So I wrote about Bill 5 because why wouldn't I? Obviously a very controversial bill, but it's worth noting that, as the Premier has said, Ontario is not the only government that is pursuing this kind of a mechanism, this idea of being able to use a cabinet order to strike down environmental protections or other parts of the law that different provincial and apparently the new federal government see as getting in the way of building major important projects of national strategic importance. We don't know exactly what Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to bring forward to the House of Commons, but the Globe and Mail has reported that it may not be a twin to Bill 5, but it seems awfully similar. So we've got a bit of a consensus right now among these governments that if we want to get a lot of important things built quickly, the current set of environmental and planning and regulatory laws that we have don't allow us to do this thing that we want to do. But nobody knows what the new laws should be either. So we're stuck in this position. And this is why I think you're seeing these governments opt for this kind of a tool where it's like, okay, we're going to leave the system nominally in place, but we're going to let the Premier or his cabinet ministers or the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers carve out spaces in the law where the law doesn't apply. That's the tell, if I could put it that way, that nobody really knows what should come next in terms of like environmental law or regulations, those kind of things. But we just know that the current system is not working. So, that I might be right or wrong about that. What I do think is true is that this solution that we seem to be landing on, both, as I say, both Prime Minister and Premier, it's tailor-made for a corruption scandal if they are not careful about it, right? We are talking about potentially billion-dollar decisions hanging on the personal discretion of Premier and Cabinet or Prime Minister and Cabinet. The Ford government already got into so much trouble with ministerial zoning orders, and the special economic zones of Bill 5 are like MZOs on steroids. And so one of the things that I think is going to be very true about these laws, whether we're talking provincial or federal, is that if they are used carelessly, they really are going to almost delegitimize themselves, and they are going to prove a lot of the critics correct. And so you hope that people in government are hearing that warning and are making sure that they use these powers carefully. So,
Amen.
What about you, Steve?
We're all about the McDonald's here.
Okay.
You may remember last week...
Not the ones who own a farm.
Not the ones with the farm and not the ones with the restaurants. No, these are different McDonald's. You may remember last week I was featuring a T-shirt with John Sandfield Macdonald because it was an anniversary of his becoming the Premier of Canada. Well, this week I want to talk about Sir John Alexander Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, because, of course, he is being uncrated. And I think most people know the story by now. There's been a disagreement for the last 5 years about what to do with the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald at the base of the South Lawn at Queen's Park. There are many people who believe it is inconsistent with our democracy today to feature a statue of a guy, some of whose views do not stand up to the 21st century. Yep. There are other people who have been saying, well, he was a man of his times, and no Macdonald, no Canada, and we can't keep him crated up anymore. For the last 5 years, there has been this sort of standoff on this issue. I wrote this column because I remember a year ago going to a museum in St. Louis, Missouri, while on a baseball road trip, you may not be surprised to hear. The Missouri Historical Museum, and they have a huge statue of Thomas Jefferson at this museum, and they have for 120 years. It's a very old museum. Jefferson, of course, wrote the beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence, but he also owned slaves.
Yes.
And he had children with slaves. And he also wrote, all men are created equal. So there's a lot of inconsistency in Thomas Jefferson, thank you very much. But rather than take down the statue of Jefferson, the museum has added placards around the base of it, asking questions like, how do we wrap our heads around the inconsistency of Jefferson's presidential accomplishments while at the same time dealing with his slave-owning history? And it seems to me that that was a logical solution to a problem. They've contextualized the man with his times, and it just seemed to me that that option has always been available to our members of the Ontario legislature, but for whatever reason, the NDP would not allow it. It is happening right now. So people will see the statue. They're going to clean it off because it was vandalized in the past.
Right.
There is going to be a new plaque put at the Macdonald statue, putting his record on things like residential schools into context. People will see the statue, they will read the additional context, they will learn, they will discuss, which to me sounds like a useful outcome. Now, this is happening, of course, because we've had a stalemate for the last 5 years because there's a special committee at Queen's Park that handles all this. Only officially constituted parties are allowed to have membership on this committee. So the Progressive Conservatives and the New Democrats, and they disagreed. And the Speaker at the time, Ted Arnott, felt, if they don't agree, I can't break the tie. Yeah. So stalemate. The Liberals, of course, in the last election back in February, became an officially constituted party. So they now have a seat on that committee. There are now 2 votes, I guess, on that committee to uncrate Macdonald with the contextualizing plaque. And that's why we have this change. So there we go. And that is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, June the 6th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our studio crew and those in the control room as well, where a guy named Evan is watching the show this week. Yeah, nice little guy. He's got a bit of a collarbone issue, so he's wearing a thing here. But Evan, you get better soon. And in the meantime, until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye.